and welcome to another adventure in Australian literature. And today we are continuing our bush series with Thea Astley's final novel, Drylands. But before we get to that, remember, if you want to support this channel, we have a shop, we have a Redbubble shop. Please come along, check them out. Loads of interesting things on there. Also, subscribe, like the video if you feel called to. It really helps get our videos out there. And that's that. So back to our book, our adventures. Our novel is Thea Astley's Drylands. This is her final novel. She actually died not long after this one came out, and it is another of our bush books. Now, this one is going to be quite different to most of our bush books, and I have some thoughts on why it is different, given the context that it was written in, also on how over 20 years later I then read this book, because if it was a book that only spoke to it, the context in which it was written, then that would not be a terribly worthwhile book. But I think the context in which this was written does answer the tone of this book, because you are not going to find another book quite like this in any of the other books that we have a look at, especially not any of the bush books. But even any of the books, this one, even at the time in 1999 when this came out, it was the big it won a Miles Franklin, so it was like, it's brilliant, but it's bleak. The intro in this book says it's bleak. I would actually go further. I'd say it's pretty grim, but that comes to my particular interpretation of this. So, what is this book about? This book is set in a rural community in the Darling Downs. Thea Astley is a Queensland writer. We haven't done many Queensland writers. The most notable one we have done is, actually the only other one we have done, is David Malouf with Fly Away Peter, which is quite it's a profoundly moving little story, but you wouldn't call it bleak and you wouldn't call it grim. It's actually incredibly beautiful and poetic for all the loss and trauma that is in that book. This one, on the other hand, is not like that. This one is, it would be an Australian Gothic if it were less grim, and I'll explain that. So this novel is set in, I believe, the Darling Downs. It's set definitely far west of Queensland, the rural areas in Queensland, one of those big, the places with the big expansive stations and a lot of heat and a lot of dust and a lot of drought. This is a community that is dealing with with climate change, and at a time when people are starting to talk about climate change. This is a book that does look at that from that 1990s context of people, oh no, it's just a drought, we've always had a drought, mate. No, this is something different. This is impacting us. It's a rural community that is being impacted by this because the rains aren't there. This is dry lands. This is the water is drying up, which has always been an incredibly important commodity in the country, an important resource. Though I think in the context of this, commodity is the right word. It's not just a resource, and it's certainly not shared. It's something to buy, and people's prosperity relies on it, and their prosperity has always been because there has been water. So the fact that there is now an existential threat to the water is something that is causing denial to these people, because it's not just a lifestyle, it is an existential threat to them. The narrator is a newcomer to this community. She runs the local newsagent. She had married a farmer, and he has died, and she bought the news agency. She had ideas about how the news agency could be run, but has given up in defeat in face of the low literacy and low interest in literacy and interest in literary arts among the local peoples. She is now writing a book for the last reader. And as she sits in her upstairs flat above the news agency, she sees the people of Dryland. And you don't realise this until you get further into the novel. She starts to tell stories. You start to get a picture of the people of this place. So there is the tax accountant who's hiding out because he discovered that his bosses were basically laundering money. There is the young woman come out to do, writing groups in rural places who finds herself sexually harassed. There is the man building a boat who meets a very spiteful, vindictive, nasty teenager. There is the pillar of the community who harasses and pushes out his unacknowledged half-brother through the rape of a young Indigenous woman who was working on the cattle station. And when I say young, I mean very, very young. There also is the awful marriage of one of the town councillors. You know what I said about it being a bit grim? Yeah, it can feel like a slog. And I think Thea Astley has never shied away from this sort of subject matter. But I was having a look at this. Like she does talk about this. She talks about colonialism. She talks about feminist ideas. She talks about women, about the position of women in an incredibly blokey, patriarchal rural culture. So she has these ideas already in her body of work. So none of this is new. What shocked reviewers when it came out is that she had taken away the hope. She had taken away the things that these people had that they could put behind them, so that they could lean on them, so that they could stand up to this. The reason I would say this is, it's like an Australian Gothic, but it's an Australian Gothic where the have another beer mate, have another beer mate, have another beer mate has been stripped away, and all you see is the nasty that's underneath that. So it loses the Gothic quality, the veneer that makes that the Gothic a particular genre. So it's an Australian Gothic without the Gothic in some ways. It's just Australian ugliness. Now, I have a theory about why this book is the way it is, because this was published in 1999. One of the things you realise when you read this is that all these stories of Australian ugliness are the stories that Janet is writing. They're all her interpretations of these people. So here we have this outsider who is looking at this community as an outsider and seeing it as just sheer ugliness and brutality and nastiness. Now, that makes this kind of different to a lot of the other rural books, simply because often those are written from within, from the inside, looking out. And so they see different things across that. But the other reason I think this is written like this, and the other reason why I think she has given it a very unvarnished ugliness, is the time it was written. It's 1999. A Conservative government has come into power for the first time in it had come into power fairly recently in 96, after quite a long time, over 10 years of the more progressive side of Parliament government in our country having been in government. So you have a newly Conservative government, which is quite conservative. But you also had, with that particular election, a element of race baiting that had not been seen for a very long time in Australian politics. You had seen this very, very ugly, something we thought we had grown out of. I certainly had never seen this in my country. It's something that has grown, and I wish to God we would grow out of it, but it seems to have caught on. It's something that is currently sadly having a moment, is race baiting. And I think it was definitely something that I think that took a lot of Australians by surprise when it happened in the mid-90s. It took a lot of Australians by surprise. I think that the violence of it, not physical violence, but just the vitriol that surrounded the race baiting that became progressively stronger and adopted by the Conservative Party. What had been a fringe, hard right concept started to get adopted by a mainstream party and has somewhat continued. So that had really shocked us, because we thought, oh no, we're a modern progressive country. Yes, we're a colonised country. We have a settler community and an Indigenous community, and the prosperity of the settler community has been at the expense of the Indigenous community, which is a commentary that Thea Astley makes repeatedly. It is a common theme in her book, and it is very starkly seen here in the treatment of the Indigenous half-brother of the pillar of the community. Is very easily read as a metaphor for the prosperity of the settler community, the settler part of Australian society, prospering at the expense of its Indigenous society. That's very, very clear. Like, that's not unreadable. But we knew we were at the time this was written, and at the time this politics changed, we knew this was an issue in our society, and we still are, but I think as a society we felt we were making progress. And then a Conservative government which used race explicitly, while a lot of other things had been very much, yes, this is a problem and we need to address this. The government at the time this was written exploited race expressly and created divisions across race, including between the white community or the settler community and the Indigenous community. Anyone who lived through the whole Mabo Wick decision thing knows exactly what I'm talking about. So that was something that I think caught Australians unaware, especially even older Australians who had lived through like Thea Astley had lived through the 67 referendum, who had thought we are getting better, things are improving. To have that happen would have been a real shock. I think it was a real shock to a lot of Australians, that level of anger and hate. The other thing that you had in 1999 was the referendum on the Republic, which was very, very deliberately skewed to retain the monarchy. I do remember that the option for a Republic put forward was not what people wanted, and so it was deliberately done because the Prime Minister was a monarchist. It was deliberately done to retain the monarchy because it was known people aren't going to vote for something and then because this is our one chance and nobody wants this model. This was not the model anyone actually wanted. So people voted it down. So all of a sudden, people who felt that they were living in a progressive country moving forward suddenly found themselves living in a regressive country moving backwards. And I think that partly explains the tone of this book. I think that partly explains why it is so grim. I think that looking at it with hindsight, or looking at it over 20 years on, the context in which this was written explains why this book is so dark. Australian books are rarely this dark, but I think that political climate is the reason that this writer at the end of her career was suddenly feeling very hopeless and did not feel that she could give any of her characters the hope that she had given them in previous novels. Now, how did I read this? Because that is the other side of this. Now, I read this you can read this in multiple ways, but one of the ways I read this is I found it very interesting looking at it in terms of, and I think this was a particularly unique to me experience because of the nature of my work. I have read a great many unpublishable manuscripts. I'm just saying, I have. Unpublished and in some cases unpublishable without a great deal of work, sometimes not at all. And the stories in this book struck me, the grim quality of the stories in this book struck me as particular to the character who was telling those stories. The character Janet is not a writer. The character Janet is a former bookseller who has lost hope out in this back of nothing place. And she has the quality of the unpublished writer about her. And it's to Thea Astley's great credit that this enormously talented woman has been able to recognize what actually makes a unpublishable or an unpublished author. It's an unpublished author. Not unpublishable, but unpublished. There are a few characteristics of the unpublished author in this. The stories are highly judgmental. The author has not moved from goodies and baddies into a more nuanced depiction of people. This is often a sign of an unpublished writer, and a writer who has read in a very specific genre is now attempting to write outside of that genre, but is bringing the characteristics of that more, I'd like to say, juvenile, because it generally is a quality of young adult literature, though not exclusively, where you have defined goodies and baddies. But they're taking that and they're wanting to place that in what this is, which is a literary fiction. And goodies and baddies, in that very explicit white hats and black hats, if you want to talk Western style, doesn't exist. There is no explicit goodie and baddie of the, you know, unreconstructed 1950s Western. There is no John Wayne. And yet, this one actually doesn't have goodies. This is a writer who even dispenses with goodies. There's no John Wayne to come in here. It's all the nasty ones. It's all nasty. Actually, no. There are a couple of people who would be the white hats, but they're not powerful enough, because she wants to create this writer, not Thea Astley. This writer is wanting to create a mustache twirling, very obvious villain. Okay, so there aren't a lot of real hero characters. But good people in this narrator's mind cannot stand against bad. So you have that element. The other element you have is the idea that if it's bad, it must be profound. It's a very, again, naive concept that, if I tell stories about really big subjects, I will be, it will be important. One of the big things about telling stories about really big subjects, if you don't have the skill, it's not profound, it's agonizing. It is agonizing to read those things. Now, these are not agonizing to read, but they're incredibly difficult to read. The cruelty in them is incredibly difficult. But I think that is done deliberately, again, because that is a characteristic of unpublished writers. There is a forgetting of that this is not for your consumption. This is for a reader's consumption. And if you don't give them some reason to keep turning pages, or if you create something that is overwhelmingly hard, and the only thing they're keeping going is the hope that something might get better, and you never give that to them, that's the thing that's going to stop you getting published. It really is. There is a reason Australian books have the qualities that they do, because they are what keep us reading. Even things that are tough, there is always that hope. She has hope in most of her other books. This one is quite unique, and that's why I think she's doing this. She's taken this narrative voice for a reason. There is this assumption among unpublished writers that if I talk about things that are grim, if I talk about things that are dark, that makes me profound. Oftentimes, does it have anything to actually say? Becomes a good question. Now, she is a talented enough writer that she's able to say something and do this at the same time. Because what you realise is these stories are stories. These are Janet's view of the townsfolk. We don't actually know what the townsfolk are really like. We have no idea. None. But in Janet's view, they are twisted, deformed, and malevolent. They are nasty. They are just, their characters are made ugly. And so that that's saying something about Janet as much as it's saying something about the town. So that becomes a really interesting way to read this. So it's a tough book. I'm going to read more of her. I've got a couple of others of hers that I'm going to read. I'll bring them to you. I'm hoping that they are have some level more hope in them than this, though this is somewhat it is counted as fairly unique in her oeuvre as being bleak. She is an incredibly important writer. She does have things to say. There is a satirical element to it, which, you know, a lot of great Australian writing has. But it's a slog. I'm not sure I'd make it my first encounter with her. It was my first encounter with her, which may have been a mistake or not. I don't know yet. But it was certainly an experience. There really was only one story in here where I was like, I don't want to keep reading this. If you want someone who has a similar sort of tone at times, though not quite so dark, I would suggest that Tim Winton and Richard Flanagan do similar things. I haven't actually really brought either of those authors. I must do so. But even them, they're not as dark, but they're writing at a similar time. And I think that the bleakness reflects the time. Also wasn't a great time for Australian publishing. So I think that also reflects that, because one of her big rallying points is that she's living in a world that doesn't read. I don't think it was necessarily a great time for Australian letters, Australian writing at that time either. So I think that there is a certain cranky old lady in this. There is a certain shock of the political climate, but there is an enormous amount of skill to be admired. But that is Drylands. It is a version of the Australian bush that you're probably not going to find again. I'm going to be back again sometime later with more adventures in Australian literature, or I will actually be back in June before that, because June is going to be on this channel Shakespeare Month, because our new book is coming out on the 1st of July, and for June we are going to have Shakespeare Month. So watch out for that and have a look at what I bring you for Shakespeare Month in June. Anyway, lovely to have you and bring you on an adventure in Australian literature, and I will see you again another time. Bye-bye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.